Hi everybody, my name is Alex. This is my first YouTube video, specifically my first Booktube video. So welcome to my channel, My Friend the Reader. So I'm going to do a proper intro video probably a little later, but today as my first video I kind of wanted to do something for Canada Reads, which the competition is starting next week, and just so people who aren't necessarily from Canada, who might not be aware about the tournament, it's kind of like the Tournament of Books in the United States. It's a celebrity spin to it. So what happens every year, CBC, which is our national broadcaster, puts together 5 books under a particular theme, and they assign a particular judge, usually a celebrity of some sort, to advocate on behalf of their book. And so they announce a long list sometime in January, then there's a short list of 5 that comes out sometime in February, and ideally by the end of March, when the competition actually happens, thousands and thousands of Canadians have read the books, have opinions of them, and then there's 5 shows throughout a week where slowly one book gets knocked out each day, and then a champion is declared at the last show. This isn't a tournament that I've necessarily followed very closely. It's been going on for many years, and several very good books have come out on top, and I think in general it has encouraged many Canadians to pick up the books. When they announce the short list, Chapters or Indigo or independent bookstores, they all put the 5 selected books at the front of their stores. I think the sale numbers go up considerably, so it's definitely a boon for authors, especially lesser known ones. So in general, I think the competition is it's a positive thing because it encourages Canadians to read more. There have been problems over the years. I think the competition can get quite nasty. It's almost Survivor-esque, where people might gang up on what literally is the best book to remove it from the competition early on, so that their particular book has a better chance of winning later on. And that's definitely, I think, we've seen in the last couple of years where books that were considered front runners get knocked out very early. Last year, The Break, which is a very powerful story about violence against women in Indigenous communities, which many had pegged to be the winner, the best book, got knocked out in the first round, and that created a bit of controversy. I think a lot of anger online, on Twitter, people who are following the tournament. So, you know, there's pros and cons. This year I decided to actually follow the tournament, and largely because the list was actually quite good and interesting. I'd only read one of the books going into it, and I'll get to that one in a second. So it encouraged me, hey, whatnot, you know, I read tons. I have a blog that I've been, you know, writing reviews or comments on book awards and things like that, and I figured let's follow this book tournament. A lot of Canadians are reading the books, and I was quite interested in most of the titles. So I'll get started then. The first book that I'm going to comment, and it's the only one that I actually have a hard copy for, and hopefully I can get this switched over, is American War by Omar El-Akkad. This book came out last year. I had actually picked it up, or I'd heard a buzz about it before it came out. Anne Kigman, who used to run or co-host the podcast Books on the Nightstand, which was a wonderful podcast, had pitched it on another show that she was on as a book to watch out for. So I did, and I picked it up, and I liked it very much. The story, Omar El-Akkad's a journalist. He used to write for the Globe and Mail. He immigrated here, I think, as a teenager, and lived in Canada for many years, and now is in the United States. And this is his first novel. It takes place kind of in a dystopic future, 70 years from now. there's been a second U.S. Civil War that came about when the northern states created or banned the use of fossil fuels. After there had already been huge environmental destruction, the coastal cities no longer exist, and the population of the United States had moved inwards. And at that time, the northern states decided to ban fossil fuels well after it would do any good. Several southern states had rebelled and lost again in a civil war. And it kind of takes place there, and it follows one particular character, Sarat Chestnut, who is a young southern woman who lives in a refugee camp following the Civil War. And it traces her experience of what happens afterwards, her becoming almost a guerrilla fighter, a terrorist, fighting against the northern occupation of the South. It asks a lot of good questions. I think it kind of asks what pushes people to commit grave crimes. It pushes questions of environmental destructions as definitely a warning to, I think, readers about the potential negatives that might come out of environmental destruction and global warming. And I think, there's different takes I really enjoyed from it. I found it was interesting for the perspective to come out from a reactionary population in many sense, a degree of cultural backwardness or reactionary political instincts in the United States South. I thought that perspective was, provided a very fulsome view of what was going on. There's an interesting take because in the story here, it's the Middle Eastern states that are promoting internal conflict in the United States, and it's a clever take on traditionally the Americans' negative role that they've played in the Middle East, provoking conflict at various points. In terms of the 5 books, American War is probably the strongest as a literary product. I'm not sure it's a book I would necessarily want to win. It's already been a bestseller. Tons of people read it both in the United States and Canada. So in some respects, it probably doesn't need the extra attention, but I'm enjoying to hear people's take on it and their discussions about it. So the next book in the Canada Reads competition that I want to talk about is The Marrow Thieves. Now, The Marrow Thieves is written by Cherie de Maline, and it's a story. It's also a dystopic tale that takes place in the future, and it centers around Indigenous Canadians who in this distant future are hunted down. What had happened is that as the world is collapsing and there's environmental degradation, whites can no longer dream, and the way they try to get their dreams back is by kidnapping Indigenous members of society and stealing their marrow, which is seen as where the ability to dream comes from. It's a YA novel. It's written quite well, actually. I didn't find some YA is very simple, and in this case that wasn't the case. It follows a young boy by the name of Frenchie who's been separated from his family, yet finds a new community of nomadic Aboriginals who are forced to be nomadic because they're being hunted down. One of the reasons I think it should win, and just to give you a sense, is the theme of this year's Canada Reads competition is a book that opens your eyes. And recently there's 2 not guilty verdicts of accused white men who had been accused of killing Indigenous youths. And one was the death of a young woman named Tina Fontaine, and the other a young man, Colton Bushi. The cases are riddled with horrible things, and it raises a lot of questions about racism within our judicial system, and the kinds of threats that Indigenous peoples feel from just their everyday experiences. And I think the reason why this book, I think, touches upon that is because I think to a certain degree it'll give people some insight into why some people in Canada feel this sense of that they're targets, that they will be future victims of potential genocide, that these sentiments come from real experiences. And I think in many ways, and obviously this book wasn't written after these verdicts, but it touches upon that sentiment. And I think that's something that Canadians need to be exposed to. And I think that having more people read The Marrow Thieves, which I've heard from my independent bookstores flying off the shelves, so people are, but I think more people exposed to it will be of great value. The next book that I also enjoyed was The Boat People by Sharon Bala. Now, this is a refugee tale. The context of it is a boat filled with Tamil refugees arrives in the east coast or the west coast of Canada and proceed to enter the refugee adjudication system. And it follows three different characters primarily. One is a young Articling student who wanted to go into corporate law but gets pulled into these refugee cases, who's of Tamil descent but has very little connection to her community, yet gets thrust into this because the lawyer on it sees her as a potential asset. One is the Mahindan, who's one of the refugees, is a widower father who's done everything he can to get his son into Canada, and it traces both the experiences he has once he is in Canada and kept in captivity, but with some flashbacks into his past, the experiences of genocide of the Tamil community during the Civil War in Sri Lanka. And the last is Grace, who is an adjudicator who's appointed by a very right-wing government, hoping to be harsh and not open the doors to refugees, but is confronted with her own experiences, her own past experiences as the daughter of Japanese Canadians who had been through the internment processes in the Second World War. I like this book a lot. I think it echoed to a certain degree a book that One Canada Reads a couple of years ago, and that was Lawrence Hill's the book, The Illegals, which was not a very good book. The writing was poor. The characters were caricatures. The evil characters were cliched. It was something I truly didn't enjoy. It was important, I thought, politically, but it wasn't well written. In some respects, Bala's book has similar kinds of cliches. And almost to a certain degree, there's a cartoonishness of some of the government ministers. But my sense is it probably bases itself on the previous Canadian government, where some of these people may have been cartoonishly evil in reality. So it wasn't necessarily that off. But it's a much better book, and it's captivating. It's well written. Sometimes books with too many different storylines are difficult to get really consumed into. But in this case, she pulls it off, and I think it'll be a strong contender as well. Two books that I wasn't quite as impressed. One was Forgiveness by Mark Sakamoto. Super interesting premise. So Mark Sakamoto's grandfather was an East Coast Canadian that fled an abusive home, joined the army during the Second World War, and was sent off to Asia to spend most of the war in a very brutal Japanese internment camp. And Mark Sakamoto's grandmother was a Japanese Canadian who gets interned in camps here in Canada during the Second World War. And the whole idea is how, despite those brutal experiences, the dehumanizing experiences they went through, they managed to overcome them and not hold grudges, and found ways to forgive those who had committed those crimes, and that it allowed them to, when their families ended up uniting in some way through marriage, they were able to put their past behind them and not let their resentments be barriers. And then that pushes forward to the author's own experiences of forgiving his mother, who was an addict, who dies at a very young age, and his own process of learning from his grandparents' actions. Two things I didn't like about the book: the writing's not fantastic. It's pretty straightforward. Sakamoto's not an author, not a novelist, so that's not to be expected. But the thing that I felt was lacking even more was that it missed the biggest, the meatiest part of it, which is it didn't delve into how the grandparents actually overcame their anger and resentment. That was what I was looking for. I really wanted to get him to delve into that. And partly he may have not been able to, I think by the time he chose to write this book, his grandmother had already passed away. His grandfather was quite old. And so it turns into just this plot device rather than a really interesting avenue to explore. And I think it would have been a stronger book if he had spent a little more time on that. The one I hated, I have to say, is Precious Cargo by Craig Davidson. Now, Craig Davidson, I haven't read any of his other work. I know some of it's been received some awards. One got adapted into a French film that was nominated for some Golden Globes. So I can't judge in terms of his writing quality, but this particular book I found quite obnoxious. It's a story, I guess it was after his first book, and his second book wasn't going anywhere. He was down on his luck and he was out of money, so he takes a job as a bus driver for a year, driving around kids with disability from their school into their homes, and it goes through his, the friendships he develops, the things he learns from these individuals he's driving around. But it felt so much like Davidson's asking for a pat on the back for not being a jerk, right? For showing common human decency and being a friend to these people. And it almost felt exploitative, and I don't think that's necessarily what's going on. But to a certain degree, there was an element of that left a sour taste in my mouth. So in that sense, it was not a book I would recommend. The writing's not great either. He kind of inserts this, I'm not sure if it's a future novel, it's a futuristic novel, sci-fi, with kind of the passengers on his bus becoming characters, and it doesn't really fit, and it's not particularly well written either. So those are kind of like inserted between the chapters about the experience. So in the end, that would definitely be my least favorite if it were to win, and sometimes the least favorite actually ends up winning. In general, it was a fun experience reading the Canada Reads books. I thought 3 of the 5 were quite good, and I'm not sure if, other than American War, I'm not sure if I would have gone out and picked them up otherwise. I hope the Merrill Thieves win. I think there's, especially the last couple of years, the one book that seemed to be carrying the mantle of Indigenous literature has been kind of tossed out very early in the competition, which is a shame because it's a literature that needs to be promoted more. And this particular book was quite good, and I hope more people read it. It's good for adults, it's good for teens, anyone should read it, and I think it's something to pick up. I'd be happy with American War of the Boat People as well, but either way, you can follow on CBC. I'll put a link down below in the video. It's on the CBC radio, I think throughout the week, and they do a broadcast on television later in the day, and I think it starts next Monday, and it runs all week, and then there's a winner, and the winner always gets a big publishing bump, so it's a pretty big deal. So it's worth checking out whether you're in Canada or not. I'm sure you can just link up to the CBC radio website and be able to listen in, because it's fun to hear people who aren't necessarily literary critics talk passionately and intelligently about books. So that's it. Thanks for joining me on my first video. I'll hopefully have more to come.